So, welcome once again to our study of the Bodhicharya Avatara, the way of the Bodhisattva, which we're studying in a summarized form through the guidance of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, as always, please generate the enlightened motivation that directly sees how this actually is getting to the heart of the matter. And with that appreciation, then understanding that we're doing this not just for ourselves, but really with the intention to temporarily contribute to the happiness of others, and ultimately really commit to the project of establishing all sentient beings in perfect enlightenment. So we are presently studying the chapter on meditative concentration. Last time there was a line that threw me. I sort of, as soon as the class was over, I kind of got it. But anyway, I'm just going to revisit that one. So it says, since the pain of others does no harm to me, I do not shield myself from it. So why to guard against my future pain, which does no harm to this, my present me? And the point really is that, and this is where we're going to be engaging something that we call absolute analysis. We're using reasoning to see the futility of some of our assumptions. I'll speak a little bit more about that, but anyway, basically just what we're saying here is that the pain of others, well, you could say, well, that doesn't really, right now, I'm not feeling the pain of others. Yes, it's unfortunate, but I'm actually not feeling it. So why should I shield myself from it? Why should it be my concern? And that's where we take that position because we're not experiencing it right now. So that's where we have to say, well, what about my future pain, which does no harm to this, my present me? And that's, again, right now, that's actually what falls into the same category is actually the future me. You know, there I am, you know, down the line in need of superannuation and all the sort of preparations I do for my future. I plan, organize, and so on, so that my future will be comfortable. Well, we do that, don't we? But that's interesting because we actually are equally other. We are actually not experiencing that future right now. So from the point of view of not experiencing who we are in the future and also not experiencing the other, they're equally both other, and as such, the logic that we apply when we say, well, the pain of others doesn't really concern me, then we should apply that to the future I. We should say, well, you know, whatever comes in the future, you know, that's not really my concern. But of course, we do care for the others and for our future. And the point really here is on the same logic, because we are thinking kindly towards someone in the future, namely ourselves, then we also should think kindly of others because they're equally other. But we are extending an intelligent, you could say, embracing of that other. And that should apply equally to the other, which are the other people. So in that we don't experience any of the discomfort, neither of the others nor of ourselves in the future, yet we care for ourselves, and also we should care for others. So Shantideva makes a lot of arguments that really is intended for us to take us out of our ordinary, you could say, limited perspective. So that's where His Holiness says, one might think that one has to protect oneself from future suffering because the I that suffers now and the I that will suffer in the future are the same. But not. He says this is wrong because what we think of as I is a succession of instants in a continuum of consciousness, and the I of the moment that will suffer in the future is different from the I of the present moment. So in that we actually just are living the sense of I moment by moment, and as such there's not actually there's nothing but just some continuum that carries. It is actually not the same. We'll look a little bit more on that. But I actually just remember something that I tend to forget, which is His Holiness's sort of suggestion that we begin the class with just some preliminaries, which are then these three. The first, the quote from the Vinaya, then the quote from the Prajnaparamita, and finally the practice of taking refuge in developing bodhicitta. So it says, abandon evil doing, practice virtue well, subdue your mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. Like a star, an optical illusion or a flame, a magical illusion, a dewdrop or a bubble, like a dream, a flash of lightning or a cloud, so should one consider all compounded things. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. Again, one of the unfortunate things with translations is sometimes it doesn't quite convey the sort of the full story. And that line there, I've said this a few times, where it says the merit of practicing generosity and so on. Generosity and so on refers to the entire practice of the what we call paramitayana. So it actually refers to the practice of the Mahayana teachings. So just keep that in mind. It's sort of the English and so on sort of always leaves it a little bit sort of, I don't know. In the Tibetan, it's not seen as a fault. And of course, in English, we can also adapt. And the implication here is we need to appreciate that so on actually is a rather big deal. But sort of just in our linguistic usage, then normally so on is sort of like, and so on, not so important. But here, very important. Anyway, so through the practice of the Mahayana, we will establish all beings in a level of perfect enlightenment. 99. It is for the sufferers themselves, you will say, to shield themselves from injuries that come. The pain felt in my foot is not my hands, so why in fact should one protect the other? Now when you see these quotations here, right, this is essentially, you could say, the objection. This is very much basic to Mahayana methodology and Buddhist methodology in general, that you sort of, you make your point in the context of dialogue or dialectics, that you don't just say, this is how it is. You expect somebody to say, hey, why? Can you explain exactly why? So in the Mahayana, there's a huge appreciation for actually this sort of dialogue, because when somebody questions, when somebody doubts, that means they're actually listening. If they're just sitting there saying, okay, yeah, I'm good with you. I paid my dues. I'm a Buddhist. I'm not an intellectual. I'm just a practitioner. I'll just go with whatever. Then you have a very weak and rather simple-minded faith that doesn't really connect. There's no traction. So if there's a debate, if there's actually a questioning and a doubting taking place, then that means that there's something there that you're taking it seriously enough to question it. And that's a place that any educator would love to have. You're not just, you want to convey something that has meaning. And so Shantideva, he wants that there's somebody who objects to what he says. And so he's imagining that there's somebody who says, well, mate, it's for the sufferings themselves to look out for themselves, not my problem, that sort of thing. So, it's up to them to look after themselves. And then Shantideva says, well, the pain felt in my foot is not my hands, So why in fact should one protect the other? So there is, I'm in pain, I just bumped my foot and I reach down and I'm sort of rubbing it or whatever. So there's clearly foot and hand are two different things. And yet there's you could say an awareness of the pain in the foot, and so the hand reaches out. Now you might presently think this is a bit bizarre, but that's where we are applying what we call, well, we're applying reasoning. And that's where the implication here is that ultimately there actually is no self. And yet we are very concerned with this sense of me. And as long as we're sort of holed up and narrowed down to just being the concern of me, we actually are not really aware of the other. But the thing is that fixation and, you could say, diminishing our being into just being this self-centered project of I or ego, that's actually delusional and entirely constructed on confusion. And it's an assumption that we've been habituated to, so it's almost like second nature. So here we need to we're using some means to sort of begin to sort of dislodge the solidity of this structure. And we do so by questioning the sort of what we take for granted. And this, for one, the whole idea of self, which we take for granted, is something that actually we really should question, because we actually are many different things, and yet we, well, like we've seen a few times, we attribute singularity, permanence, an unconditional sense of I to what in fact is really just flim-flam, a set of causes and conditions that we attribute solidity to. We'll see more about that in the next verse there. But the bottom line is we are applying this thing that we can call absolute analysis, which is to see that actually there is not the self there that we think there is. And we can approach this in terms of the analytical, which we use a lot here, and also we can approach it in terms of the intuitive, which is drawing on our everyday life experience, where we can actually see when we're less caught up in ourselves, we actually care for others. We actually extend ourselves to others and we feel better. We're much happier when we are letting go of ourselves and so forth. So it's not as if it's just a moralistic or categorical imperative like you should be selfless. It's just that we cannot actually find any self. And also we're actually much better off when we don't get caught up in that. Now here it's important. I want to make a big point here. That is that when we say all these things here, we're not saying, well, Buddhists, they say that one should be selfless and one should think of the other. That's not it. That's not at all it. We're not suggesting that there's something we should do, some sort of prescriptive, advice of some sort, or actually a command that we should be in a particular way. That's what we call moralism. And that can, to some extent, be good if it's the same one that applies when we say, when you're in Australia, remember to drive in the left side of the road. If you're in Europe and the US, remember to drive in the right side of the road. Yes, that is prescriptive. That's, you could say, a good moral compass to go by. But it's also something that's based on evidence of how it actually works. So it's not as if when you talk about the Australians, then you then say, well, Australians, they believe in driving in the left side of the road. It's that, or you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So when the Buddha says, to let go of the self, it's not like the Buddha says, well, this is my system, that's my opinion, you can take it or leave it, It's not the Buddha's opinion. It's not like we can say, well, that's very nice, Mr. Buddha. You can, of course, have your opinion, but I don't believe in that. That's not what's going on here. And that's why we need to see that this is based on us observing the nature of things. It's It's not my opinion that water boils at, I don't know, 98 degrees or whatever. You know, that's not an opinion. It's something I can verify. And when we cling on to the self, and when we say that this is a delusion, when in fact there is no self, that's not something that the Buddha just has an opinion about. This is something that we can verify. And that's why the methodology here in Shantideva is about us questioning and again saying, wait a minute, I think that it feels like there's a self. And why is it he's saying that? Shouldn't I just, look out for myself? And that's where the Shantideva says, try and look. You cannot find anything there. And that's where this is not about Shantideva having an opinion. It's about Shantideva would like us to please see that everything goes much better if you drive in the left side of the road in Australia and you drive in the right side of the road in the US. So that's not about belief. So so we have to be really clear about this in terms of approaching what the Buddha says. It's completely transparent out there for us to verify. So here, for example, then we were simply just saying this thing about, the suffering of others. Well, why don't they just look after themselves? Why should I have to do it? So Shantideva says, if one were to think that everyone should take care of his or her own suffering, one could argue that the hand should protect only itself and no other part of the body. There is no reason why the hand should protect the foot. Although we might find this argument convenient, it is not at all logical. Let us stop being stubborn and thinking only about ourselves. So we also see this in people who are in close relationship, who are really open to each other. For example, parent and child. We would, we very often we would say that the parent would much rather have the pain of the child than have the child undergo a particular pain. So this is not something that's just sort of mystical or otherworldly. This is very real. It's really there as soon as we begin to relinquish the narrowness and uptightness around this self-fixation. So His Holiness says, let us stop being stubborn and thinking only of ourselves. And then this notion of the sort of the sense of me who's undergoing this thing. He says, continua and gatherings, so-called, like garlands and like armies, are unreal. So there is no one to experience pain, for who is there to be its owner? So what we call self is really just moments, continua. Again, this is when you have like a mala, you can see there's a lot of beads and it constitutes a mala. But it's really just something that's put together, a lot of different beads strung together. And similarly, also when you have, for example, an army, talk about the army cohort, right? Well, there is, in fact, there might be, 10,000 soldiers or whatever, but we refer to them as singular. And so also with this self, there is no one there, just like there's not actually what we call then this mala and also an army cohort. There is actually no such a thing. It's just something that we label. This is very important. Everything that we experience, we are in fact just labeling it. And that's actually, it conflicts with how things are. Giving it a singular label actually has nothing to do with the way things actually exist. It's convenient. Yeah, for all practical purposes, I am Jakob, and so on. And for all practical purposes, this is my watch. But it has actually nothing to do with the reality of things. This is labeled as one thing, but it is so many different things, and we can keep endlessly analyzing it down to breaking it down. Similarly with ourselves. So we can actually say there is no owner of the pain. Suffering has no possessor, therefore no distinctions can be made in it. Since pain is pain, it is to be dispelled. What use is there in drawing boundaries? So there is no possessor, and yet there is the experience that we're having. So that's where we need to distinguish between what we call the absolute analysis and how things are experienced. Because what we can say to ourselves, we can't go around saying, making a political party of no self and saying, everybody, you should just be selfless and so on. We can apply this to ourselves. That's where we have the wisdom to see that actually there is no self. Meanwhile, sentient beings, others, they don't have that, you could say, advantage to be privy to this insight. So that's where our job is not to say, well, they should just sort of realize selflessness, shouldn't they? We should just realize that there actually is no self, and we actually care about the suffering of others. We can't expect them to realize that. And that's where their pain is our concern. So His Holiness says, when we talk about I and beings, there are not independent entities. They are false labels applied to a continuum of impermanent elements, just as a necklace is applied to a string of beads, or army to a collection of soldiers. However, if beings had no real existence, who is in pain? Why try to dispel the suffering? So that's where we might overdose on the truth of emptiness. But that's where we fall into the extreme, and then we kind of think it's some sort of reality for others, but it's not. It's reality is entirely what we make of it. And so presently we're cottoning on to the fact that phenomena don't exist solidly as having these existing in terms of these labels, these imaginary labels that we put onto things. But that doesn't mean that that others don't experience that. We do to ourselves, presumably. So he says, so the opponent here would say, why try to dispel suffering? You know, why should we be bothered? And Shantideva then, or His Holiness then, says, although the I does not truly exist, in relative truth, everyone wants to avoid suffering. This is sufficient reason for dispelling the suffering of others as well as our own. What is the use in discriminating? So that's where we share a common fate with others, which is this belief in a self and the solidity of it and the solidity of the phenomenal world. We fail to see the empty nature of phenomena. We fail to see shunyata. And so as a consequence, we're suffering. But presently, we're on to becoming a bit wiser. And that's where we're applying reasoning. We're beginning to sort of see the narrowness of this project of self. So we are beginning to sort of cotton on to and be inspired by the sweetness, the flavor of the Mahayana. This feels good. This feels right. Actually, the other day, there was some BBC article. It was sometimes when journalists, they get on to philosophy and things, it's a little bit funny, but it's valid. And there was basically the journalist commenting on a book that some Harvard professor had just published about, the hedonistic project wasn't perhaps the sort of what really would bring happiness, despite what we think that, just getting everything we want might not make us bring about the ultimate happiness. So that was, I forget the title of the book, and it's just a few days ago, but anyway, it's sort of like, well, that's wonderful, really, that, yes. And he was also making the point, very often, the suffering and challenges of life sort of molds, good character in individuals. And there's sort of now sort of peer-reviewed, research that shows that for a fact. Okay, that's very good. Anyway, so then Shantideva says, but why dispel the pains at all? Says the other. Shantideva responds, you cannot argue in this way. If my pain is removed, so too should that of others. If theirs is not, then neither should be mine. So why should we go out of our way for others? I already suffer enough. Should I really have to be bothered with the discomfort of others as well? So His Holiness comments, we might think, if I meditate on compassion and think of the suffering of others, it will only add to the intense pain I already have. We only think like this because we're narrow-minded. So just being quite blunt there. If we do not want to help beings, then their suffering will be endless. But if we can develop a little compassion and make an effort to dispel the suffering of others, then that suffering will have an end. Without our taking the responsibility to help others, there can be no limit to the suffering. And that's also where the Bodhisattva, part of the Bodhisattva motivation is that we're going to do this alone. It's not like we're going to generate a whole sort of groundswell grassroots movement where everybody's going to be working on dispelling the suffering of each other. We can't expect that. So it has to be something that we take on as our project, and we can't expect it from coming from anybody else. That's where the Bodhisattva spirit is, I will do this and I'll do it on my own without, relying on others. Not that we don't care about others, but just that we are willing to take full responsibility. So His Holiness continues, when we develop a broad mind and feel compassion for others, this is vastly beneficial. Any small difficulties we might experience are worthwhile. So, and that if through such a single pain, a multitude of sorrows can be cured, such pain as this, all loving people strive to foster in themselves and others. Let me just read that again. If through such a single pain, a multitude of sorrows can be cured, such pain as this, all loving people strive to foster in themselves and others. Yeah. So the implication here is that we're willing to go through the discomfort. We're going to have the pain of helping others. But if that pain can be something that actually brings about the end of suffering for others, it's worthwhile. And Kunzang Palden, he says, it's a bit like when we have some medical treatments that might involve some discomfort, but it has a benefit. I remember Chakra Rinpoche, when I was staying with Chakra Rinpoche, he was a doctor, and he would actually, there was a particular kind of, I guess also you have it in Chinese medicine, where you put some herbs and you let them burn down to the skin, all the way down, and it sort of leaves a bit of a mark and so forth. But it actually, just like acupuncture, it actually has a profoundly healing effect. And of course, it's uncomfortable right there, right for the moment. But it actually ultimately has a benefit. So similarly, also, then this sort of pain that we're going through in the process, it's something that we're willing to do. His Holiness then comments, the great bodhisattvas are prepared to do anything, even lose their lives, if it will eradicate the misery of numerous other beings. So that's understanding the spirit and the scope of great bodhisattvas. Even so, at the level of sort of small-time bodhisattvas, there's still the willingness to go through discomfort. So at this point, we're not talking about or encouraging sacrificing, making the ultimate sacrifice, but it is that spirit really that they could say permeates the bodhisattvas. And that's also why bodhisattvas are such objects of respect. Those whose minds are practiced in this way, whose joy it is to soothe another's ills, will venture into hell of unrelenting pain, as swans sweep down upon a lotus lake. So that's where there's no hesitation on the part of the bodhisattva to enter into painful existences to benefit others. They're simply untouched, but at the same time, it's vastly different from this sort of sense of, ooh, I don't want to go there, and I'd rather not be involved. I would rather not get my hands dirty. There's not at all that. There's an absolute joy in getting one's hands dirty. And for the bodhisattvas, there's an absolute joy in entering into lower realms if they can benefit others. Shantideva says, the ocean-like immensity of joy, arising when all beings will be free, will this not be enough? Will this not satisfy? The wish for my own freedom, what is that to me? So again, this is moving away from self-centered objective and acknowledging that the real joy comes when we brought joy to others, when we've freed sentient beings, which is the ultimate objective of the Mahayana. but we also know it from our own experience, where we're happy when somebody we care for actually is freed from their discomfort. So His Holiness comments, for a Bodhisattva who wears the armor of determination, the joy he or she has from alleviating the pain of infinite beings is sufficient on its own, even if they suffer a little themselves. How could achieving liberation for oneself alone, while abandoning our promise to liberate others, be better than that? And that's where, obviously, our own suffering is not going to be, in any way something our freedom from suffering is completely undesirable if others suffer. It's a little bit like, it's almost, and again, this might sound like incredibly high, sort of idealistic, but it's not. We have it in ordinary relationships. I was just thinking about here where I live in near Byron Bay. There's a story about a honeymoon couple who were out swimming, and a shark attacked the woman, and the guy actually managed to distract the shark so that the shark ate him, killed him, and the woman went free. And of course you say, well, that's just terrible, this poor woman, and terrible for the guy. But can you imagine? It's all, it's permeated by intense suffering, the entire situation. But can you imagine the other situation where there's a shark attacking the wife, and then the husband goes, ooh, a shark, and swims away? That would be seriously sad. That would really, really be sad. And imagining being the survivor of that. There's also, if you ever watched the Titanic, there's Kate Winslet's character has a fiancé who, as the Titanic is going down, he actually manages to get onto this, the lifeboat with the women and children, and basically just being completely concerned about himself. But we, in ordinary conventions, we view that as despicable. So we're not just talking about, you could say, some high ideal, like I was saying, but it's something that very much is present within our ordinary, you could say, expectations to ourselves, and also ordinary expectations in terms of when we extend ourselves in a loving way to others. So in a way, the project of the Bodhisattva is not all that unfamiliar. And that's also where the Bodhisattva lives in that joy, lives in that dignity of not retracting into the fearsome, self-centered project of just self-gratification. It's all about really there's a joy in being there for others. So we say, on the same note, we actually say the Bodhisattvas, justifiably, they fear samsara, confusion, but they even more fear nirvana. Because what would it be to go into peace and have your freedom if you know that others are suffering? In a way, samsara is understandable because there's sort of confusion that drives suffering, and it's understandable. But for somebody who has wisdom and freedom to actually choose to ignore others, that's very sad. That would be a sad saint who's just sort of like, well, I'm out of here. And that's, of course, this is very much, you could say, the distinction then between the Mahayana and what we call the Hinayana. But we should never say, oh, there's this tradition that's Hinayana and so on. Hinayana is just the Mahayana term for the initial moment where we're concerned about ourselves before we graduate to this vastness, this great courageous condition of mind, where we fully are then understanding the view of selflessness and also the practice of selflessness. So Shantideva says, the work of bringing benefit to beings will not then make me proud and self-admiring. The happiness of others is itself my satisfaction. I do not expect any other recompense. So we're not doing this sort of like, I'll be a bodhisattva and then I'll be so much better. Yes, I'll be, I'll be greatly admired. I'll be greatly happy. I'll be greatly satisfied. So, so that's not what there is implicit in the bodhisattva motivation. The bodhisattva motivation is just a very straightforward, uncomplicated sense. Others are suffering. I care about that. So His Holiness says, let us never think, if I help others, I will accumulate positive actions. I will be a virtuous person, and in the future I'll be happy. This is not the point. Let us do positive actions with profound compassion to relieve others' unhappiness, and let us dedicate these actions to their well-being from the depths of our hearts, without the slightest notion of future personal reward. So this is also where of course, it's the happiness that we achieve, the joy that we achieve, while it's not the ultimate objective, it is a you could say a bonus. It does come about. It does happen. And we sometimes say enlightenment is achieved on the seat of others, meaning us actually completely identifying with others and including others. This is what will bring about enlightenment. And His Holiness also talks about the intelligent egotist is compassionate, you know? So we can market this idea in terms of it will bring us happiness, for sure. The Mahayana path will bring us happiness. But the point, or rather, this happiness is not the point. And really, what drives the Bodhisattva is the concern of others. And that's where we say, as the Bodhisattva progresses along the path, we talk about the 10 Bodhisattva levels. There's increasing degrees of wisdom. And that consists of the Bodhisattva being less and less self-conscious of helping others. So that's where the notion of subject, object, and action, we very often, and I've mentioned this a few times, I hope you'll bear with me, we very often talk about how we dedicate free from the threefold concepts of subject, object, and action. And that basically means that we serve others without thinking in terms of, I am doing this for somebody else. And look, I gave them $5, you know? So that's where the kind of notion of, wow, I am doing great, you know? That becomes less and less and less. And why we would venerate the Buddha, why we venerate the Dalai Lama, why we put them on a throne, is not because they have a whole lot of learning, it's not because they can do miraculous deeds, it's because of the absence of this self. There's no chance of them getting, you know, all puffed up about themselves if they're put on the throne. That's the reason they're there, is because they don't care about that. So that's where the degree to which the Bodhisattva then advances on the path, to that degree, there's less and less this notion of actually being concerned about themselves. So His Holiness says, we shall now discuss the exchange of self and others. This practice consists of putting ourselves in the place of others and putting others in our place. If we train in this, we come to consider others more important than ourselves, so that their happiness and suffering becomes more important than ours, and when they are harmed, we feel it as acutely as when we ourselves are harmed. This is not difficult to do if we have realized the disadvantages of thinking only of ourselves and the benefits of cherishing others. Our exchange of self and others becomes so vivid and strong that it is easy for us to give our lives for others. And by others, we mean all beings everywhere. So again, what we're talking about here is not an ideal that we just think, oh my God, I should think more about others. That's not it. This is an objective of training. You know, it's not as if, gosh, if only I could run 50 miles. Well, you know, some people can, but it takes training. So it's not as if we're supposed to and expected to run 50 miles, you know. I'd like to be a healthy person. Healthy people, those who run 50 miles, they're very healthy. They, maybe, you know, I should run 50 miles and I'll be very happy. Well, we can't do it. So that's where we train. And the training is based on us initially then realizing that, first of all, the disadvantages of thinking of ourselves and the value of cherishing others. So we're going to first, before we start doing the 50 miles triathlon, whatever challenge, we begin to reflect on the advantages of it. We begin to recognize the disadvantages of not being fit and the benefits of being fit. We realize why it's good to think of others. So once we have that, we actually essentially have what we call the view. There's a completely clear understanding. Then we practice this And then it becomes, yes, it becomes something that's very easy for us. That's like those who practice triathlon, they can do extraordinary, feats of running and swimming and what have you. So that's where eventually we will have that. And the scope here is then all beings at all times. It's not as if I'm just going to do it for the people who, think like me, or, who look like me, or et cetera, et cetera. It's for all beings. What actually it consists of is then that we care about others to the extent that actually what others are going through, we feel it. There's this famous story of Atisha's teacher. I think this was Maitri Yogin, and there's a story of him one day teaching when in the audience there was somebody who threw a stone at a dog that was passing by, and as soon as the stone hit the dog, Maitri Yogin sort of went, "Ow!" And people thought, he's sort of, he's exaggerating, but he actually had a wound on this place, on where, where the dog had been hit. He also had a wound on his side. So we do see these examples, and also I think I've often given the example of what's his name again? One of the students of the first Drudupchen, Jigme Lingpa had a student of his. I always forget, Jigme Kelsang, Dola Jigme Kelsang, who was traveling. He was on his way to the Five Peak Mountain in China on pilgrimage, but he came across someone who was being executed, and he basically said, "Hey, no, this guy, he's innocent. I done it." And he was executed in the guy's place. He just couldn't bear. It was a rather painful way of execution, and he just couldn't bear to see this guy suffer. So that's there's nothing to lose in that. We might think, "Oh my God, he lost his life. That's extreme." And of course, we shouldn't do that. But that is then, you could say, the spirit of the Bodhisattva. So it says here, just as hands and other limbs are thought of as members of a body, can we likewise not consider others as the limbs and members of a living whole? So same thing again. We should not be deterred, His Holiness says, by the difficulty of such a practice. It is a question of getting used to it through training. For example, it's possible to become used to a person whose mere name once made one afraid. One can even reach the point where one cannot bear to be separated from that person. So I guess this can play out in various ways, but yes, there might be people that we initially didn't like, and then once we got to know them, actually we become very close and very fond of them. Okay. See some questions. Oh, someone's onto my forgetfulness. Says, can we take refuge and generate bodhicitta together first? Sorry, please don't give up on me, okay? Okay. If no self, equally there is no other. Right. Why, in this case, would we worry about others if they're equally not there in the first place? Well, that's the difference between relative and absolute truth. Yes, the self and others, that construct exists within us. So that's why we should be selfless. But others who are suffering, they don't have that notion. And that's why we should care for them, because they don't have that. They're stuck in the relative truth. So that the Bodhisattva, yes, will know that this distinction of subject-object is a flawed, artificial fabrication of confusion. But others are not having that experience. And so we're aware that others, they suffer. And so we're there for them. Yeah. So that's where it's important that we understand really the science of this, which is not making some sort of statement that there is nothing out there. We're talking about what individuals experience. And so the experience of a confusion, it plays out in the experience of samsara. And that's where we're stuck. The experience of non-confusion plays out in terms of the experience of awakening in all the qualities and so on. That's the reality that we're looking at. But we're not supposing that this is some sort of absolute, that if there was never any self, no other, well, then we would never be here in the first place, right? But there is. We all individually go through all these sufferings, and we care about what others are going through. So I often wonder, from a biological perspective, why a sense of self is so pervasive. Might it be part of our history of survival, particularly when we had to run from a saber-toothed tiger or die? Scientists have identified that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex may produce a fundamental model of our self and place it in mental time. So to break down our attachment to self, we may well be going counter to what the human brain naturally leads us to do, even though there are no longer any saber-toothed tigers. Well, there's other things we can run from. There's still all sorts of discomforts that sets off that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, undoubtedly. But you see, we're not talking about being impractical here, and it's not as if you're out there with the Buddha and the saber-toothed tiger comes around, getting a bit lost. Somehow you ended up in India, and you go. And the Buddha then says, "Oh, well, you know, that's just you know, the self is just an illusion. Let yourself be eaten by that tiger." That's not that. So we're not talking about, you could say, a pragmatic sense of self, even though that, okay, we're going to go back to what's the primacy of mind and matter and all of that. But certainly, presently, within relative truth, the Buddha is not it's not identifying, or rather, the Buddha is not suggesting that all of a sudden we dismiss that ordinary practical instinct. So you could say the survival instinct and so forth, that's completely natural, but it's also something that's generated as you could say, part and parcel of this samsaric condition that leads to us entering into this world. So of course, our entire, you could say, physiology, including the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, that is constructed by the mind that thinks I, and that already is, you could say, deeply habituated to re-embodying itself again and again from that position. So you could say our entire being is really what we call karmically constructed. So that's part of, that's basic to our being. But at the same time, we're looking at this as part of a delusion. And so we're also seeing that this assumption that's basic to the entire notion of self is actually flawed. So practically speaking, for the time being, we're not going to just sit and wait to be eaten by the saber-toothed tiger, or, you know, bitten by the brown snake or whatever. But we're going to be very practical, and that's where you could say it's intelligent to do what's necessary to avoid these discomforts. But on the other hand, and again coming back to something that's much greater, and that's where I drew in the example of, let's say, the person who sacrifices himself for his newlywed bride there. You could say his same prefrontal cortex really also might say, hey, there's a shark, you know, and then, you know, runs away and, you know, just says, well, you know, I'm just conditioned, you know, my chemicals, I'm just conditioned to just move away when there's a shark. Too bad for my wife, and I'm very sad about that. But, you know, that's just how I am. And that, of course, is probably what actually would play out in 95% of the cases or whatever. But you also know that that person would be miserable. And you know that the 5% who, you know, who offer themselves, well, there's a sense of just all of us just going, gosh, that's so sad, but what a wonderful person. And that woman would presumably for the rest of her life have a deep respect for that person who sacrificed himself. So we have, on one hand, we could say we have the way that we're conditioned on the basis of our karma, but we're also presently looking at the possibility of liberation, of, you could say, lifting our game somewhat. Yeah. So that's what we're talking about here. And again, so what we often sort of discuss is what came first, mind or matter. And that's where in the Buddhist case, as far as the relative experience that we have, the mind is really the one who rules. Yeah. So that's where there's a little bit difference between this position and that of biology. Yeah. Mind you, I don't think necessarily there has to be a conflict. So of course, biology is able to map, the workings of the mind, but of the physical and the biological systems and all of that. But I think it would also be helped, and it would explain a lot. And there are biologists, for example, Francesco Varela and others, who have actually made a point in sort of venturing into the science of Buddhism and actually drawing some interesting conclusions in relation to, you could say, the science of biology. So, can you talk about the difference between Zinba and Shenpa? Specifically, how relevant is it to know the difference emotionally as a beginning practitioner? Well, let's just pretty much say it's on the same place. It's Zinba and Shenpa, they both are situated within the self. It's the fixation. So when we fixate, it's actually synonymous, really. Shenpa. It's the act on the part of the subject to fixate on phenomena in terms of labeling it in a particular way. So that's also where we have the famous quote from Tilopa, who says, Naropa, you're not caught by the object, you're caught by your Shenpa, or you're caught by your the grasping subject. So as a practitioner, oh yes, and right from the word go on the Buddhist path, we address this. This is why we presently, everything we're talking about here is essentially about letting go of our ordinary habitual grasping or fixation, our ordinary Shenpa. I know Pema Chödrön uses the word Shenpa a lot, and it's a great word. And Zinpa is a bit more sort of, you could say, scientific. Shenpa is more sort of in terms of, you could say, the sort of, it's slightly more sort of practical, really. But they indicate the same thing. And so, so as practitioners, right from the start, the moment that we're beginning to look beyond just the habitual patterns and projections, that's letting go of Zinba. When we're practicing meditation and we're training to not be distracted and caught up by our ordinary ignorant or blind sort of being absorbed in our thinking, that's also there. We are relinquishing our Zinba and Shenpa. Thank you for sharing the beautiful love example of the husband and the wife and the shark. Very great example of naturally inclining to love and protect others. Okay. Then, okay, this is coming back. This is our, thank you very much. I'm very grateful we have, and like I was saying earlier, this entire sort of methodology of the Mahayana is very much based on debate. So I'm very glad that we have a biologist in here. So then equally our brain has areas related to completely altruistic behaviors. Yes, and that's thanks to training in bodhicitta in previous lives. Or training in bodhicitta now. And you will see there will be individuals who are born with that part of the brain less developed. And that's where we might say, well, that's just genetics, or that's this, that, and the other. Yeah, for sure. But again, how come we are born into that particular situation? So we actually, as aspiring bodhisattvas, we aspire that we may again and again be born with brains that have, you could say, greater altruistic behaviors. And again, we're completely on par with Richard Davidson's research and everything. Great meditators, their brains change, right? Is Shantideva talking about interdependence, how our happiness arises through bringing happiness to others, but also being self-aware and critically working on ourselves in the same way can be questioning of others. so as not to be compassionate idiot or doormat. Absolutely. Yes, yes. What we are doing here is being aware of what's happening with ourselves, and this enhances our intelligence. So it's both being aware of ourselves, what's going on with ourselves and others, but there's a predominant sort of concern about the others. So it doesn't mean that we all of a sudden just are going to indulge others and let them walk all over us. Yeah. Is there a word before Shenpa when we are observing rather than being taken? Well, it's pretty much what we call prajna. When we're not caught by Shenpa, there's a capacity to be aware, and this we can generally refer to as prajna or awareness. Yeah. That's really what we cultivate through vipassana practice and on the basis of shamatha. And it's also that which then has it, as you could say, we become more and more familiar with that quality of prajna and vipassana. Also, if it's practiced properly, then naturally it's imbued with compassion. The less there's fixation and shenpa with regards to self and other, then there's an increasing accommodation of the other and an increasing ease also with regards to oneself. That's what I've heard. Thus have I heard. Evam Maya Shutram. Really struggle watching movies when someone jumps in front of a bullet or dies for another. Understand it's noble, but also hard to watch. The scenario with the shark is devastating, for sure, for sure. But the opposite is even more devastating because it's so profoundly sad. You know? There you're left with some sense of just nobility, painful as it might be. But the other one, you know, the whole idea of the selfish gene and so on, that's profoundly depressing actually. And it's very, very problematic when it becomes part of the cultural discourse, that it's the norm. So that's where if you want to have a political angle on this, you know, you'd want to, you could say, influence the discourse to move away from an acceptance of self-centering as the norm and suffering as the norm, to appreciating that suffering need not be the norm, and there's a basic goodness that's present. Yeah, feel for the woman who lost her love. I hope she's okay. For sure. Yeah, I mean, our hearts all go out to her. You know, yeah. But you see the difference, yeah. So we very often have this sad, cynical view that yes, we're all basically egotistical, and that is very problematic. And unfortunately, it is sometimes consolidated by sort of the idea of the selfish gene and so forth. So so it's as much as this nobility is something that you might think of as extreme, it's something that sort of provides a great vision for our humanity, if you like. You know, it's also, you know, in the stories that we tell in the Buddhist teaching, you know, for example, of the Bodhisattva in previous lives, like we have the story of the Bodhisattva offering himself to the hunter who had been out looking for food and failed, and the little Bodhisattva as a rabbit came along and says, "Hey, eat me," you know. And there the hunter transformed into Indra, and really Indra was just testing the Bodhisattva. but as an honor, and to honor the Bodhisattva, we say Indra then painted, or rather with some ashes. Indra had a fire going, so with the ashes of that fire, Indra painted the image of the rabbit on the moon. So if you look up at the moon, if you look up, then you'll see the rabbit up there. Someday you'll have somebody point it out to you. And that kind of story, it spells out a very sort of empowered, feeling about our humanity and our, you could say, potential. Not just us humans, including also rabbits, obviously, but in general, basic to being a sentient individual, there is this greatness, and it's sad if we think of it otherwise. Living with a huge "if only I had" can be totally debilitating, for sure, for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm sure everyone here gets it. It's for sure. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us here. Conclude with dedication. Let's see. We'll start here next time. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. So thank you. See you next week.